The forest kingdom breathes in silence. Welcome to Fantasy Journeys. Chapter 4: The Architecture of Patience. They did not approach directly. Cael moved north along the channel's edge, parallel to the structures rather than toward them, and Lira followed his lead without discussion. It was the right instinct, the instinct of people who had spent enough time in unfamiliar places to know that a direct approach was rarely the most honest one. Better to arrive sideways, better to let a place reveal itself at the pace it preferred. The ground beside the channel was firm, the dark bread-colored soil compressed here in a way it wasn't further out into the valley, as if this path beside the water had been walked often enough to make itself. Not a path exactly, no clearing of vegetation, no worn groove. More like a preference in the earth, a direction the ground was inclined to offer. Lira kept the channel to her right and the valley's northern slope to her left, where the structures were becoming gradually more legible through the trees. She was trying to count them. It was difficult. The problem was not the distance or the light. It was that the structures did not present themselves as discrete objects. They overlapped with the living trees, and with each other, and with the rock face behind them, in a way that made boundaries impossible to fix. She would identify what seemed to be a wall, trace it for several feet, and then lose it where it met a tree trunk, whose bark and the stone surface had achieved, over sufficient time, the same color and the same texture. The wall did not end. It became the tree. Or the tree had grown against the wall, long enough that the distinction was no longer useful. She had seen ivy consume buildings before. Old structures in the eastern provinces, abandoned country houses where the vegetation had taken decades to make serious inroads. But ivy consuming a building looked like conquest. The building still there underneath, the ivy draped over it. The two things separate in their relationship. This was nothing like that. This was a process so slow and so mutual that it had bypassed conquest entirely and arrived somewhere else. Somewhere that did not have a word she knew. Cael stopped. She stopped beside him. Ahead, the bridge she had seen from across the valley was now close enough to examine properly. It spanned the wide, flat channel, at a point where the channel narrowed slightly, perhaps 20 feet across rather than 30, and the arch was low and wide, rising only a few feet above the water's surface at its highest point. The stone was the same pale limestone as everything else in the valley, but at the arch's keystone she could see, even from here, that the fit was not natural. The blocks were cut, not with the precision of modern masonry. The joints were not perfectly uniform, but with the confidence of someone who understood exactly how much precision this particular arch required, and had given it that much and no more. On the bridge's crown, the dark green low plants had established themselves in a strip along the center, following the line of the arch's highest point. Their roots had found purchase in the joints between stones, in the years, the decades, the centuries, since the roots had expanded and contracted through the seasons, freeze and thaw, and the joints had widened around them, but the arch had not failed. The plants and the stone had negotiated and arrived at a working arrangement. She thought of a word from a structural engineering text she had read in the archive, looking for context about historical building techniques. Accommodation. The text had used it in a technical sense. A structure's capacity to accommodate load changes over time. She was using it now in a different sense. Something closer to its ordinary meaning. The keystone is original, Cael said. He was looking at the bridge's underside, crouching slightly to see the curve of the arch. He did this, found the structural heart of things before he looked at anything else. Everything else has been worked on, replaced in sections. But the keystone, he pointed, that color. The stone is darker, older, different source. She looked. He was right. The keystone was a slightly warmer tone than the surrounding blocks, the kind of difference that was invisible if you were looking at the bridge as a whole, but obvious once pointed out. A different quarry, or the same quarry at a different depth, or simply stone that had been cut first and had had more centuries to develop its particular relationship with the valley's particular humidity. So, they kept building, she said. They didn't just use what was here. They kept maintaining, he said. It was a distinction he seemed to find important. She thought about it. Maintaining implied the original construction had been complete at some point, that there had been a finished state that was then preserved. Building implied ongoing expansion, but Cael's word felt more accurate for what she was seeing. Not the maintenance of a fixed thing, the maintenance of a living one. The difference between preserving a painting and tending a garden. They crossed the bridge single file, leading the horses. The stone underfoot was smooth with use and very slightly bowed at the center from centuries of crossing, the surface worn to a gentle concavity. No railing on either side, just the flat crown of the arch and 4 feet of width. Enough for a person and a horse, no more. Fen crossed without hesitation, her hooves finding the curved surface with the same careful economy she brought to everything uncertain. The sound of her steps on the stone was different from her steps on the valley floor, crisper, more present, each footfall briefly distinct before the valley's ambient quiet absorbed it. On the far side, the trees were older still. She could not see the sky at all now. The canopy above was so dense and layered that the light reaching them was the palest possible version of itself. Not dim exactly, but thoroughly processed. The difference between this light and the outside world's light was the difference between a direct statement and the same statement recalled from memory, present but translated. The structure she had identified as a tower from across the valley was up close, less a tower than a vertical continuation of the cliff face itself. The rock here had been shaped. She could see the evidence in the angles, in the deliberate flatness of certain faces that would not have occurred without intervention, but shaped with tremendous restraint. What had been removed was minimal. The cliff face had been tidied rather than transformed. Where a natural ledge existed, it had been extended outward a few inches to create a broader surface. Where a vertical crack had formed, it had been opened slightly and smoothed, creating a recess that functioned as a window without looking like one. She stood before this cliff that was also a building and understood, with the particular clarity of a perception that had been building for some time and finally completed itself, what she was looking at. They had not built on this landscape. They had edited it. Small interventions, made with deep knowledge of what was already there. The landscape had offered shapes, the cliff faces natural ledges, the channel's natural course, the slope's natural grade, and they had taken those shapes and clarified them, completed them, in the way a printmaker cleaned a woodblock, not carving new images, but sharpening the ones already present in the grain. The result was a place that looked, from a distance, entirely natural. That was the point. That had always been the point. Cael had moved further along the cliff face and was standing before what she had initially registered as a shadow, a darker vertical space between two sections of the stone. Up close, it was clearly an opening, a doorway, but not one she would have recognized as such from more than 20 feet away. No frame, no threshold step, no architectural indication that this was an entrance rather than a crack in the rock. Just a space where the stone was not. Tall enough to pass through without ducking. Wide enough for one person at a time. She watched Cael study it. He had the particular stillness he adopted when something was not resolving into what he expected it to be. He tilted his head slightly left, then right. "I keep deciding it's natural," he said, without turning, knowing she was there. "And then I look at the sides, and it isn't." She came to stand beside him. The sides of the opening were smooth, not the smoothness of water-worn stone, but the smoothness of stone that had been worked and then used. Shoulder height on either side, the rock had a slight concavity from contact, from the passage of bodies brushing the same points over a very long period of time. Not deep, half a centimeter, perhaps less, but consistent, present. She thought of a doorway in her grandmother's house, a low stone arch in the kitchen passage. The stone at shoulder height had had the same quality, worn not to sharpness, but to softness, the evidence of every person who had ever passed through that space, compressed into the texture of a single stone. A record that was not a record, a history you could only feel. She reached out and touched the side of this opening. The stone was cool and faintly rough beneath her fingertips, and in the area of that concavity, it was slightly warmer, storing heat from something, from the collective warmth of long passage. Inside the opening was darkness, not absolute. The isotropic light reached even here in its most diluted form, enough to suggest a space beyond rather than a wall. She could hear the water differently from inside the threshold. The three registers rearranging themselves in the enclosed acoustics of the passage. The high register was suddenly clearer, as if the stone was conducting it. She did not go in. It was not her space to enter without invitation, and the thought arrived so naturally that she did not question it. This was not the caution of trespassing. It was more like the consideration you offered when approaching someone's home, the pause at the gate, the announcement of presence without intrusion. She stepped back from the threshold. Cael nodded, barely perceptibly. They continued along the cliff face, more openings at irregular intervals, more of the worked but naturalistic surfaces, more of the plants finding their arrangements with the stone and the stone accommodating them. She began to notice that the vegetation was not random in its placement. Certain plants grew in certain positions in relation to the structures, and the consistency suggested intention. Not a garden exactly, More like a sustained preference. Certain species allowed in certain places, others absent from them, the result of choices made continuously over a very long time, until the choices and the outcomes had become the same thing. She was counting the structures again, failing again. There were more than she had estimated from the valley floor. She could see now that what she had read as a single complex was actually several, distributed along the cliff face over a distance of perhaps 400 feet, connected by the elevated channel and by paths of that same ground preference she had noticed by the water. Not one settlement, but a neighborhood, and one in which the buildings had been given enough time and enough space to become part of the same conversation as the trees. At a wide point in the cliff face path, where the ground leveled briefly and a large flat stone worked, she was certain now, worked flat and set level, extended outward from the cliff like a broad step. She stopped. From here she could see the full eastern extent of the valley, the wide flat channel curving away into the trees, the two bridges visible from this angle, and a third she had not seen, smaller, spanning a point where the elevated channel dropped to meet the valley floor in a series of small falls. Below all of it, the valley's silence, not absence of sound, but the particular quality of sound that had no edge, water and leaf movement, and the occasional distant sound of the thing she had heard before, the stone-on-stone percussion. Its direction shifted now, closer. She pulled out the map for the 6th time that day. In the personal notation section, the structures along the cliff face were rendered not as buildings, but as a series of small marks that she had originally read as topographic, indicating a change in slope. Now she understood them differently. The marks were the same height as the actual structures relative to the valley floor, proportionally accurate. They were not symbols for buildings. They were the buildings, reduced to the minimum number of lines required to be faithful to them. The cartographer had not marked doors, had not marked windows, had not distinguished between natural cliff and shaped cliff, because that distinction from inside did not exist. She was about to close the map when her eye caught the small notation she had been returning to, the phrase beside the northernmost cluster of marks, in the intimate hand, smaller than the formal notation. 4 words she had been setting aside because they did not make sense as topographic description. She read them again. The stones remember everyone. She stayed with it. Not metaphor. This cartographer did not use metaphor anywhere else on this map. Not decorative language. A notation, like all the others. Factual. Precise. She thought of the concavity in the doorway stone, the warmth stored in it, the cumulative passage of every body that had moved through that opening over every decade of the valley's inhabited life, compressed into a geometry of wear. The stones remember everyone. Below and to the north, the figure she had seen bending and straightening at the channel's edge was no longer visible. In their place, nothing, just the trees and the water and the structures emerging from and returning into the cliff face, unchanged. Then, a sound from behind them. Not alarming, the opposite of alarming. A single unhurried footstep on the flat stone where Lira was standing. the weight of it distributed carefully, set down with precision. She turned around slowly because there was no reason to turn quickly. The woman was already there,